This conversation focuses on state regulatory considerations, of which there are a whole bunch. In theory, state legalization programs are supporting communities most harmed by the war on drugs. State regulations are intended to protect public health and generate taxes for social purposes. Cannabis regulatory experts will review the impact of state adult use legalization on the state medical programs, including the cost of benefits as well as the successes of these social equity programs and the impact on the illicit market. So it's with my pleasure to bring Dr. Tishler back up, who will be moderating this other really critically important conversation. Welcome, Dr. Tishler.
Thank you. Yeah, it's me again. Hello? Okay. So yeah, sorry, it's me again. I will say that I have very little experience being a moderator. I'm usually the panelist, so I'm going to do my best, but you guys can throw eggs and tomatoes later. So we're going to talk about state regulatory issues, which is also not my bailiwick. But thankfully, we have three wonderful experts here for whom this is a lot of what they do. So let us start by having some self-introductions. Why don't we start on the end with Kevin?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, I was on the other way. Hi, I'm Kevin Conroy. I'm a partner here at Foley Hoag. I had some remarks this morning, so I'm going to be really brief. I used to be, before I was in private practice, I used to be the Deputy Attorney General here in Massachusetts, the #2 person at the Attorney General's office. And so I've always had an interest in state regulatory structures and state regulatory issues. And somewhere around 2016, we decided to do a deep dive into cannabis. And much of my practice is representing cannabis licensees with challenges with their state regulatory officials. And so I represent companies often before the Cannabis Control Commission here in Massachusetts, either helping them get licenses or more often than not, trying to get them out of trouble. And then I also help companies in a variety of other jurisdictions. Often with large transactions, you need to get approvals from multiple states. And so my firm and I will help companies throughout that process. I also was representing a client in a hearing probably in around 2013 that Kay Doyle ran before the Department of Public Health. I want to tell you, I was unsuccessful with that client, and I've held a grudge here for the last 10 years.
He warned me he was going to come after me. So. Thanks, Kevin. So as you just heard, I started in my cannabis journey around 2013, serving as the primary counsel for the medical use marijuana program at the Massachusetts Department of Health after Massachusetts passed medical marijuana in Massachusetts. And I actually have the distinction of serving as the first government employee in Massachusetts history to be paid solely out of cannabis-derived revenue. So it's a weird claim to fame, but nevertheless, one I own. I then became one of the inaugural Cannabis Control Commissioners and dealt with some of the issues that Kevin just described, as well as many, many others that I'm sure we'll discuss here today. So with that, I will turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Lauren Niehaus with Trulieve Cannabis. We are a multi-state operator on the industry side. My foray into cannabis was spending a decade working with an Attorney General Association, mainly as the Western states were coming online and these regulatory programs were beginning to shape, and the state attorneys general didn't really know what to do with cannabis at that point. I think we've gotten everybody around to they're at the place of enforcing the laws that either the voters or the legislature have created, but now I work in our state and federal lobbying efforts on the private sector side. Right.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. So we have a lot to talk about. We sort of talked about how to organize this, and I kind of wrote down a few questions that were sort of pegged at a few of you individually, but I want everybody to have a chance to weigh in. The discussion seems to come up a lot lately as we're talking about state regulation and the interface with federal regulation about preserving medical. And as I think you all have gleaned, I think that the concept of preserving medical is the wrong question, right? Preserving to me sounds a little like we want to wrap it up in cellophane and put it over here on a pedestal where we can stare at it periodically. But what we really need is to serve patients. So how do we go beyond preserving? How do we go to expanding and improving? Lauren?
Thanks. I think that it's an important question. We all know that when an adult use program comes online, medical programs, patients generally decline. Not generally, always have declined. And I think that a part of that is ease of access, education for the patients, creating that patient-doctor relationship in terms of what do I need from a medical standpoint versus what am I just purchasing as an adult use customer. There's education about the taxation. All adult use programs have a tax associated with them, whereas the medical don't. But most importantly is for industry, doctors, and patient advocates to have a voice at the state legislature, to make those medical programs better, to increase the telehealth or reciprocity or whatever each state's priority is. But I think it's incumbent upon all stakeholders to work with their state legislatures to enact the changes to keep those programs alive and flourishing.
Yeah, I agree with Lauren. I especially want to touch on the issue of telehealth, which I know got brought up earlier in the day during the medical panel. But I think one of the things we all learned during COVID is how much we can do with technology now and how we can make the world a lot more accessible to people who have disability challenges or other immunity challenges that make getting around the world a lot more difficult for them than the able-bodied. And we really need to take this opportunity to take this learning moment from what we all went through and see what we can do to make cannabis more accessible in programs so that they have the opportunity not to have to make being certified for cannabis an ordeal, not having to go through a bunch of hurdles that may not be necessary if we can make it an easier road for them to hoe. So Kevin?
I think there's a real challenge with the medical community here, and I think we got to acknowledge it. The people in this room, thank you and many of you are involved in the medical community. Thank you for your efforts. There are not enough of you who are promoting cannabis and talking about cannabis, and that is what leads to patients feeling that they can't get advice, and for patients not seeing any of the benefits of being a medical patient. There's just not enough people in the medical field who are doing that, and I think states need to do a better job of promoting the fact that physicians, nurses, et cetera, need to be talking about cannabis and the benefits of cannabis. People have talked about it. The leading advisors on medical cannabis right now are bud tenders at dispensaries, and that makes no sense. And nothing against bud tenders, and I'm sure some of them are good, but they're not trained in an appropriate way to do that. And so we need to see a better partnership with the medical community. I think some of that falls on licensees. I think licensees can do a better job of reaching out to the medical community, educating the medical community, and involving the medical community in what they are doing. I will also say just one point, and this is a very Massachusetts specific point. We've really suffered in Massachusetts because medical marijuana is vertically integrated. And so we've got a number of large companies who are our sole medical marijuana providers in Massachusetts, and that's fine. But there's just not a diversity of medical marijuana providers here in Massachusetts. And that causes some of the challenges here as well.
Can you explain a little bit further about the issues with vertical integration, why we have it, why it's now become a roadblock?
Sure. I'll start. Kate can jump in as well because Kate's probably more of an expert on it than I am. But I'll start and then give it to Kay. So when we passed our medical marijuana statute via the voters in 2012. It provided for a vertically integrated system. So cultivator, manufacturer, dispensary, all needed to be the same entity. And the thinking behind that was to bring a fully sort of integrated care model to patients. Maybe that made sense at the time. Since that time, what it's led to, however, is a narrow group of companies that are provide the medical marijuana services, and at least in this state. The challenge is those companies are also, not surprisingly, jumped into the adult use market. They have, and of course they should. They've got big facilities. The dollars right now are in adult use because we don't see a growth in the patients on our medical side. And you know, those companies are, while they have a good core group of patients, many of them, and these two women can talk more about that because they're with the companies, but we're not incenting pushing medical marijuana. And so one of the things that would make sense here on the state level, although I'm not sure it's going to have it, we are where we are a little bit on this, is breaking the chain of vertical integration. It doesn't make any sense anymore. Just because you've got a medical dispensary, you don't need to cultivate your own product. And most of our medical dispensaries right now are offering a variety of different products.
Thanks. So Kevin's right. So in 2012, when the law passed, if you've ever seen the Massachusetts law that was passed in 2012, it's incredibly short. The regulations that the Department of Public Health had to put together in a very short period of time had to build out tremendously on that to provide some infrastructure. And the decision that they came to at the time was that they wanted to make sure that patients who were going to come to rely on this product would have continuity of care, essentially, that the only companies that would be able to get licensed had to demonstrate that they were sufficiently well capitalized to be able to build and maintain a supply chain and be able to provide patients, and they wouldn't have the issue where they already, as we all know, have incredible challenges due to the illegality of cannabis, that they wouldn't just disappear overnight. And so that's a decision they came to in early 2013 under extraordinary time constraints, I should add, to be fair to them. But I think it points to an overall issue I think we have with cannabis regulation. As you know, a recovering state regulator myself, is that you're operating in the window of time where you are doing something, and you don't want to get to a place where the state gets rigid and doesn't evolve with the market, particularly when we have a market that is incredibly new. I mean, some of us joke, you know, I've been in the cannabis field for about 10 years, a little more, and I'm a dinosaur compared to most people who are in this world. It's like dog years or something, you know, it just goes incredibly quickly. And what was the case in 2012 and 2013 may no longer be the case now. And one of the things I think we need to impress upon legislators and regulators was what Kevin just identified, that we need to move with the market. We need to realize and understand that as things change in this incredibly fast-moving industry, that we also need to change. And deintegration is one of those things that I think needs to be reevaluated by regulators, not just in Massachusetts, but everywhere that it is, and figured out as to whether or not there are any potential unintended consequences. You do want to make sure that you protect patients, and different states have gone through different approaches to doing that, whether it be a patient reserve supply, whether it be expedited approach once you are in the facility itself. But it's something that needs to be carefully examined and studied to make sure that as you are developing policy, you are doing so thoughtfully and not reactively. And pass.
Let me jump in here and ask a question follow up to that. You know, what are the barriers to entry for a potential licensee on the medical versus the recreational side? My understanding is they were talking about, you know, an order of magnitude difference in capital, and that's just for the application fee. So can you give some more data on that?
Lauren's like, I'm happy to give that mic back to you. But it's very, very expensive, and I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. I think it was, and Kevin could probably correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think it was something like 500,000 for you had to demonstrate that you had access to liquid capital of 500,000, and then 400,000 for each additional facility, for a grand total, if you were going to build out to the state max, which is currently, and this is another point, incredibly still at the same amount that it was back in 2012, when we originally thought we were only going to have 35 dispensaries in the entire state. We now have 286, but everybody's still capped at 3. But for those 3, you would have to demonstrate that you had $1.3 million in relatively liquid capital, which would certainly be out of reach for me. But obviously out of reach for many. And so it had this effect, as Kevin was just saying, of really reducing the applicant pool down to those who are sufficiently capitalized to meet what the Department of Public Health felt was necessary to secure patient supply.
And in one other example, when talking about that medical adult use conversion we're looking at in Maryland right now, and the approach that they took, luckily, the legislature listened very carefully. They took all existing operators' 2022 revenue. Lucky for the industry, it wasn't a great year, but that is what they based your license conversion fees on. So if you are a single store operator, you are still paying in the high 6 to 7 figure conversion fees. And unfortunately, if you can't pay those and convert your dispensary into a dual dispensary, you are not able to operate until you have enough capital to make that conversion. Luckily, the legislature put in payment plans for over the next year and a half, but it's a significant challenge.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, look, for those of you not from the Northeast, you can't build a dispensary in Massachusetts for less than $2 million. Excuse me, a cultivation site for less than $2 million. And even if you built a $2 million cultivation site in Massachusetts, that would be some of the smallest cultivation sites in Massachusetts. We're between $2 million and probably $75–100 million for building a cultivation site in the state. The real estate costs are very high, construction costs are very high, and so for medical marijuana, you got a minimum. Put aside the licensing fees and things like that, you got a $2 million point of entry just to build that cultivation site, let alone your dispensary.
I remember having a conversation with the then CEO of Netta, which is one of the large dispensary groups around here. This would have been 2013, 14, something like that. And they gave me a tour of their state-of-the-art facility. And he said, when we planned this, we were going to spend $2.5 million. And I went, wow, that's a lot of money. And he said, yeah, but by the time we were done, it was over $5 million, right? So you can see that this is not for the faint of heart. So let's turn our attention back to something that you mentioned, which was technology, right? So I think that you established that there's certainly some benefit in learning from the pandemic and preserving, there's that word again, some of those lessons learned. Many of the states, for example, New Hampshire, where I'm licensed as well, has had mixed feelings about this, because they see, rightly or wrongly, that having an in-person visit, or at least on the first visit, is a deterrent to sort of the physician bad actors, if you will. And so there's a lot of talk about telemedicine and what are the guardrails and how do we make sure that, this still works for patients. So what do you guys think of in terms of, do we need guardrails? And if so, how do we best implement them? Is requiring in-person visits a good approach? Is it even relevant?
Well, I'll start. I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm not a physician. So I'll give you my thoughts. And as one who supports the cannabis industry, there are certain states, New Hampshire, Texas, other states where you've got a regulatory structure, but really what you do is you got a very protectionist structure. And so I put the requirement to have an in-person meeting in that protectionist structure, and I really don't see the need for it. I think we learned from the pandemic telehealth works. We should be encouraging it, and we should be leaving it to physicians to make decisions about the best way to and the best mode to advise their patients. And if they want to do this through telehealth, by all means, let's do it. And I think it benefits the patients, and let's just go ahead and do it.
But let me counterpoint with, if our goal is to have more active physician clinicians who are educated in taking care of their patients, how do we prevent the world from being taken over by the more unscrupulous card mills? I think that's what they're particularly concerned about. So how would we address that?
I think it's got to be parallel to whatever is happening in other areas of medicine. I think, it's time to start treating cannabis as a medicine, and therefore, if not in the same structure due to the way we're all set up under federal law, then perhaps something parallel and, compliant with what is being required in other disciplines. And honestly, Dr. Tishler, you would be better to tell us what exactly that is than probably any of us. But
well, let's put it this way. To my mind, there is a group of folks who are the most green around the gills, queasy about this whole issue, but they are, in fact, the ones that ought to be leading the charge. And this is state medical licensing boards, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're the ones that hold the physicians responsible for doing the right thing. And at least here in Massachusetts, I've talked to them twice in the last, whatever it is, 12 or 13 years about cannabis related stuff. And that was only because somebody had forced their hand over a complaint, which, by the way, in both of those cases, I found no wrongdoing when I was asked to review the records. But how do we get them involved? How do we, if we're going to use telemedicine and sort of remove that guardrail, such as it may be, because I don't think it actually helps. How do we start to get these other groups that are from this conventional model to step up and do their thing?
Yeah, and I think depending on the state, it goes to that. What can we do in statute? What can the legislature implement that forces other agencies? Again, it'll be different, but to hold somebody accountable. We as an industry are held accountable in most cases via statute by a Department of Health or a cannabis commission. I don't see why that pathway wouldn't be something that could be explored on the medical side, because like we talked about the other day, we don't want a pill mill 2.0 with cards just being, shipped across state lines, not legally, because those of us that state, are inside of a state, we do right now have an ecosystem that is inside of a state. And I think that the doctors should be held to that standard. But I also think it's a lobbying effort for physicians to make sure that their interests are upheld and their patients are protected.
And, this gets into a not cannabis related issue, which is right now physicians are regulated by their states primarily, right? And so if I were practicing in New Hampshire and not licensed in New Hampshire, that would be illegal. And quite frankly, I give unofficial advice to patients world over because there aren't enough physicians out there who can do these things. But there becomes a question of maybe physician licensing needs some revision at this point, and that this needs to be of a more national nature rather than a state by state nature. And that's kind of above my pay grade, but it's an issue. What do you guys think about delivery? I know we talked about it's not being super financially viable, but the question is, would it be more viable if there weren't requirements to also have the brick and mortar? Could we streamline some of this process, decrease the financial burden on dispensary groups, and make things better, faster, cheaper for patients if we eliminated the stores altogether and simply had patients go online, order what they need, and then have it delivered to them? I mean, God knows all my takeout food is delivered.
So I'll start on delivery, and I think we should just start with a baseline for people, especially who don't live it every day, right? So far, delivery has been unsuccessful, and there are a variety of different reasons that people think that it has been unsuccessful. But we are just not seeing a big. Companies are putting a lot of efforts into delivery, and they're not seeing the success. They're not seeing an increase in patients. And there's the question of, well, maybe people really like going to see their bud tenders, and I think there's some of that. People are used to doing that. There's also the thought that it's more expensive, and so people don't want to pay the extra cost. There's also we've talked a lot about that, the stigma that, people are concerned that they're either they don't want to be on some lists and, they're worried about the feds one day knocking on their door, or they don't want their neighbors their neighbors seeing they're getting delivery. But what we're seeing so far, at least in Massachusetts, is with very strong efforts on trying to convince patients to undertake GO delivery, they're not. Medical's been a little bit better. It's a more established delivery system. And obviously some medical patients have difficulty getting to a dispensary, and so we've seen better success on the medical side. But right now there are a lot of doubts about delivery and whether it's going to work, and maybe that'll change over time. So, but Doctor, getting to your question, I think as an industry we've got to go slow on this, right? I think our patients and our consumers like going to the dispensary, and so the idea of getting rid of the dispensaries it's one, probably not feasible, and I don't think that's a good idea in the short term. I do think there's some things we could change about delivery from the regulatory side that would open up delivery a bit, right? It is very expensive, at least in Massachusetts, to have your product delivered. There's a requirement that 2 drivers are in the car at all times, and that's really led to increased costs. Also, companies would much prefer the model where they load up the car every day and then they deliver. They deliver what gets ordered during the day, as opposed to now in Massachusetts, you've got to every time when you get an order, you've got to specifically make that order at the place from which the order is coming, as opposed to just putting in a bunch of product in the car in the morning. And so there are ways to make this cheaper, and that might be helpful. But the basic point is delivery is a work in progress here.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have much to add except, again, this is another reflection of how regulations need to evolve, because when delivery was first brought in the medical model, we had incredible pushback, but also incredible partnerships with law enforcement. And sort of the same was true when delivery was discussed at adult use. There was tremendous concern in the law enforcement community. And, in order to strike a balance that would make everybody a little unhappy, which is sort of the true definition of a successful compromise, they reached what they reached back in 2017, 2018. It's now 2023. I think we've had some years of experience with delivery, not as much, unfortunately, on the adult use side, but at least with the medical side, that we can actually look at data, which is another point I'd like to emphasize. When we were doing this back in 2013 and even in 2017, we were often pioneering something that had never been done before, and we didn't really have much to draw on. That is certainly not the case with most aspects of this industry now. It may not be a model that's in the Northeast, but it may be somewhere else in the United States or even the world, where we can access data on specific issues and utilize that to develop more sound and hopefully sustainable policy.
I think the last point I'd add on the regulatory front is many states, especially out west, give a lot of municipal deference. So whereas it might say, yes, in state law, you can opt out as a municipality. That's the case in California, Arizona right now. So there are multiple layers of the regulatory scheme, depending on where you are in the United States.
Have we seen any delivery scenarios develop problems? I mean, you talked about getting law enforcement was uncomfortable, and we came to a compromise where everyone was a little uncomfortable. Have we seen bad things happen?
I think, not to poo-poo on California, but they are an example who has had delivery throughout. And there are struggles of, and I think it's I think it's $5,000. Somebody can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong. Don't quote me on that, of product that's allowed in the vehicle. California is a big state. So if I'm traveling from San Francisco to San Diego,
Well,
what do I do overnight? I mean, that's a long delivery, but you know, there are those kinds of challenges. I think we see more storefront law enforcement issues with robberies and break-ins than we have in cars. However, I think that you look at how many stores do we have versus how many vehicles are delivering. And I think if you did that math, it's probably disproportionately at stores because there are so few cars delivering.
interesting. I would think that there would be more cars delivering, but maybe that speaks to Kevin's point that it's just not really taking off. I can certainly say that my patients, by and large, adore the delivery. Again, they're patients, so that's a different group from the adult use side. The thing that I found, again, back to Kay's point about lessons from the pandemic, that was magnificent, was all the dispensary groups scrambled to get their products online, an actual online ordering paradigm. So even if the individual were coming to the brick and mortar to pick up the product, at least they had chosen them ahead of time. And what I found when that happened was a whole lot less of the misdirection, getting the wrong products kind of thing, because the patient was sitting at home choosing the gummy. And frankly, what I told my patients and still do is, look, if you have any questions, shoot me a link, right? Which is why I live on email all the time. And that's been tremendously helpful. It's not completely related to delivery, but it's sort of a bead in that chain of improvements.
Yeah, I'll just say something on that. We did, due to Kay's good work, we did go during the pandemic to curbside pickup. And that was both the medical side and the adult use side, right? And that well, sort of, yes. Yeah. We could talk about why not on the adult use side, but and that really worked. I think our licensees liked it. They ran a good system. I don't think there were any security issues that came with that, and it was good regulating and showed how regulators can change with emergency situations.
I should give credit to Sean Collins, the executive director, for that, because as much as, we may have had to bless anything, the real hard work is often done by the, administrators, the executive directors, and the staff and the lawyers who are trying to figure out, sometimes on a very short time frame because of national emergency, international emergencies going on, what can we do within the law to affect what needs to be done to make sure patients have access to what they need. And the one thing that I will flag for folks is that, some of these COVID time regulations are coming to an end, both here in Massachusetts and in other states. And so, we're seeing the disabled really facing a challenging situation where, things they've been asking for years were only done when we all needed them. And now that we all don't need them, they're going away. So I think, one of the things we should all do as just not even cannabis involved, but just people is, recognize that they face challenges that we don't experience, speaking for myself at least, and, could use our help and support in making sure that they continue to have a world that they can actually access services, government, and whatever they need to function as people. Sorry.
Great. Keep it up. I love that soapbox. Yay. No, that's perfect. And it also a perfect segue to my next bullet point here. We, in our pre-production meetings here, talked about equity issues. And I have three things I'd like to throw back to you to talk about. We've talked about the vertical integration, but the question is, what does vertical integration have to do with the equity side of things? The second is safety, hemp regulation, equity. How do these things fit together? And the last is local control. And you already touched on it in the California model. It's certainly true here in Massachusetts and elsewhere. How appropriate? How do we implement that? Go. Yes, I'm happy to repeat these things.
You got 5 minutes. No, go ahead.
We asked the big questions.
All right, I'll start. So I know we have a lot of folks here from Maryland today, and that's great. And one of the things I would tell you in Maryland is make sure you learn some of the lessons from Massachusetts, because I know you're moving to an adult use in addition to a medical system, and there's some lessons here. So first on local control and equity, right? Our local control system in Massachusetts, because of the statute, this is not Kay's fault. We gave our communities way too much control over of citing of cannabis establishments, and I think what we've seen from that is one mayor has gone to jail, and a variety of other businesses have never gotten up and running, and unfortunately, a lot of those businesses are equity businesses. Look, the bigger guys hire people like me who go into municipalities and work our way through municipalities, but they spend a lot of money on me to do that, and it's much harder for equity establishments to do that, and there's a direct correlation between the local control and the lack of equity establishments that we have here in Massachusetts. So let me stop there, and I'll keep it going.
Sure. So yes, we had almost unique, as Lauren was saying, California has a similar thing, and unfortunately, I just heard Minnesota may have something similar as well. Yay! But we had a provision copied from the gaming laws that allowed communities to charge not only the taxes they were getting as a matter of right under law, but additional fees up to a limit of 0.3. That's on my brain, obviously. That's the next part of the question. 3%, but that was supposed to be a cap, and it was supposed to actually really reflect the costs that were imposed upon the municipality by the operation of the marijuana establishments. What ended up happening in practice was there was, and this is boring lawyer stuff, but there was a clause that basically created a loophole, and lawyers just drove through that thing like a bus, and municipalities were charging 3% of gross revenue, regardless of how much there was an impact on the community. And we noticed this in the commission. We issued host community guidance as to what was appropriate. It didn't seem to worry anyone because they knew we didn't really have any enforcement power. The Department of Revenue cautioned everyone in a local services bulletin. Didn't seem to stop anyone either. I wrote a really, really long, really boring report to the legislature. I apologize to anyone who had to read it. And luckily, after I left the commission and other folks got together and got through Chapter 180 of the Acts of 2022, a law that substantially reformed the host community agreements. And the reason that I mention it is because it's not over. A bill has been brought and will in fact be heard Monday after next to gut that bill and in fact preserve the host community agreements that were executed prior to a certain date, which is most of them. So, it's not over. The host community agreement challenge keeps going. And what I think is notable is that other states, having watched in, very thinly disguised horror what was going on here, have actually put things in their law in advance to say, don't do this to their municipalities. I think New York and Maryland may be examples of that. Yeah.
Good to see that people are learning, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I have one last point to give a plug to the previous panel. We talk about, the cost of entry to this marketplace, and that is where social equity we continue to fail social equity applicants. Yesterday, we were sitting in numerous meetings with members of Congress talking about, with multi-state operators, with single operators, how a reform to access to capital in this industry is not beneficial just for the big guys. It is beneficial for every person who touches the stream of commerce in this industry.
Cool. All right. So, any of you guys wanted to touch on the hemp side of things?
We've got a problem here in the United States because there is this THC infused hemp that is has the same effects as marijuana that is in cannabis and is not being regulated in the same fashion. It doesn't go through the testing. It doesn't. It's not grown in a regulated environment. It is not sold in a regulated environment, and it is a real problem. And children are buying it. You can buy it in a convenience store. And we've got a real problem, and it is up to state officials to not treat this as as cannabis or a cannabis equivalent and treat it what it is, which is against state law. If anybody wants to look for an example of an attorney general who's doing it right, it is Attorney General Tong in Connecticut. He has cracked down and is using his office's resources to crack down on THC infused hemp, and he's absolutely right. We've got a problem here, and at least people like me who are involved in this industry need to be clear that we respect regulators who are applying the law evenly and applying it in an appropriate fashion. You asked about tying that to equity, and it's very clear. This sale of cannabis and THC infused hemp hurts the entire industry. It hurts people, the small businesses that are trying to get up and running. It hurts the larger guys. It's hurting the entire industry.
And I think just one final point on that is that piece is a public health and safety issue, and the Attorney General's offices absolutely do have the Consumer Protection Authority to go after these products. We in this room and everybody on Zoom, we have worked for decades to legitimize the cannabis industry, and behavior that seeks to undermine that also undermines all of the hard work that we have put in to regulate and be good actors in this space. Yep. Yep.
And hurts
Can't have
patients.
that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Completely
Because
agree.
not only can they not get the products that they need, and they may be harmed by these other products, but ultimately the credibility of this industry is what's necessary for the medical establishment and the patients that they serve to be able to contemplate availing themselves of these medicines. So thank you guys for all of that wisdom. Now let us take some questions.
Hello. So I would want to start off with, research with the revenue generated. I'll just take Massachusetts as an example. Maybe Keo and Kevin can help. So with the revenue generated from legalizing adult use medical, and if there is a research need, even though cannabis is federally scheduled as, Schedule 1, and there is a research need, where is the state law as compared with federal law in terms of research where ethical clearance is needed? Where is there any possibility of promoting some research in the state as compared with to the point where it might not be legal federally? How can we work around that in the spectrum of state regulation as compared with federal? That's my first question. Can I be allowed to just ask the second one? And just to Dr. Tishler, apart from, so FDA, I wanted to ask this question related to with the first group, with the federal regulation. Now, FDA approved Epidiolex for epilepsy in children. What will be a clinical condition which would be necessary for us to push, or for a group of researchers or to be able to get a second federal approval of a drug from FDA, which medical condition could cannabis related or cannabinoids be used to treat that we could push for that? And if that will not have a federal backing, can a state regulation, a state cannabis control commission, or a state approve that research into making such a drug?
Because I've touched on so many. So one thing I didn't talk about when I was introducing myself is I actually used to work for GW Pharmaceuticals, who created Epidiolex and got that through FDA approval. To flag how difficult it is to get through FDA approval, which was touched upon in the federal panel, GW was started in 1998, and I think they got federal approval 20 years later for Epidiolex. So that's how long it takes to, especially, botanical drugs, to get through that incredibly difficult FDA process, which is the gold standard for the world. I mean, if you can get your drug through that, you're in really good shape. And in fact, they at GW Pharmaceuticals, which is now called Jazz, has another drug, Sativex, that is approved in 25 at least other countries, and they to date have not been able to get it through FDA approval. So it's incredibly difficult to do. It's not something state regulators really have much control over. It's an entirely different process. It's an entirely different lane, to borrow David's earlier reference. What we did do with the limited authority that we had was we created a research license so that people could simply possess, without fear of at least state penalty or prosecution, cannabis for research purposes. And then they could submit proposals about what they wanted to do, and we would be able to approve them. While I was commissioner there, which is in the very first start of the program, I don't think there were many applications to do much. And let's remember, we all think of research as, clinical and on humans, but there's a lot more research that can be done surrounding the plant, making it better, making it more consistent in production, that doesn't require human involvement, doesn't require that appropriately difficult supervised standard. But we tried to do that in Massachusetts. It's still often, if you're getting humans involved, will probably require some engagement with the federal government, but at least in Colorado, they've been able to do that successfully. I can't speak to whether the current commission is going to attempt to do that, but it was something that we were starting to look into.
Just quickly talk about that. Kay's right. They tried at the Cannabis Control Commission. That's an area that really needs to evolve on the state regulation side. The Cannabis Control Commission's regulations right now in Massachusetts ask for way too much information about the type of research you're going to do. And every client I've worked for who has been interested in a research license says, I've got to tell the state all of this information, and I can't be guaranteed that that information is going to stay private. And so it's been a real challenge to do to get not only to get a state research license, but to follow through that. And so that's another area where we need to see some evolution on the state regulatory.
That's actually really interesting to me, because I, at one point, I don't remember how long ago this was, called up somebody at the commission, it might have been Sean, I don't remember, and said, what do I need to do to get a research license? And basically was told, we don't know yet. So it's evolved at least so that it's known. Now it may be onerous, but at least there's that level of progress.
Now I would tell you, now you got to follow this 25-page sheet of 350 steps. So it's you're right, they got it now, but it's still very, very hard.
And I will flag that's actually an issue for many, many things in Massachusetts. We, incorporate the federal public records law, except that we don't protect proprietary information the way the federal government does. And I have no idea why, but it is an issue with, especially as Kevin was talking about, things like the research license application.
All right. Yes.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Mika Brown. I have kind of a curiosity question. We're talking about patients and we're talking about getting them care. What do we need to do to incentivize doctors? Because I've read recently that only 11% of practitioners even study the cannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid system. What do we need to do to incentivize doctors, or maybe it is an education question, because I think stigma plays a big part of it. But how do we get them to like engage in the cannabis side of medicine? My grandmother has been trying to get a medical card from her doctor at the Brigham, as she likes to call it, and he won't even discuss it with her. And so she has, you know, her granddaughter now who is like super Miss Cannabis in Massachusetts. And it's like, but my doctor won't give it to me. So no, I don't want any of your CBD, or no, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. And this is something that I hear a lot amongst elders, particularly elders that live in ADI communities, particularly elders that live in federal housing. They can't get any assistance. And that is bothersome and troublesome for me because they're on opiates instead. And they don't need to be, but they can't get past everything that they've experienced. My grandmother's 83, so she's gone through the Depression and the war and the Civil Rights Movement and all of the things. And here we are. I mean, it's in my bag. I can give it to you, Nana, and she won't take it because she cannot get her primary care doctor or her orthopedist or anyone on her team to even engage with her. So she won't go any further than what the doctors say at the Brigham.
Well, I'm going to take this one, okay?
You go, Doctor.
First of all, thank you. You just beautifully described where we are and the problems that we face, and they're astounding and unacceptable. This is why I formed the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists and why I do what I do. You know, so for your grandmother specifically, I would be happy to take care of her, and I will give you a card. I'm on the faculty at the Brigham.
They talk to this person because that's really what I just need somebody at the Brigham to do it. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you get what I mean?
You know, the issue here is a little bit complicated. First of all, those doctors they don't know what I know, which is fair. Now, part of my life is trying to teach them part of what I know, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that even if they knew some of what I know, they don't have the time to do what I do. So, you know, like Dr. Uma was saying earlier today, this really is a specialty into itself. And so I view my role as not only treating the patient correctly with this medicine, but becoming part of that patient's care team and work closely with the doctors at the Brigham or wherever they may be. And then I spend a lot of time going to the Brigham, or next week is Dana-Farber, and showing them the data. You know, it's a long process. The Brigham's better than many, but the home institution of Harvard Medical School is incredibly conservative. Yes, they're doing basic research. Yes, they've gotten a bunch of big donations, but when it comes to the clinical stuff, well, let's put it this way. I just spent the last 2 years developing a CME course aimed at the primary care doctors, and they ultimately decided that they thought it was too biased and not enough data, even though every slide had all these, you know. So the point is, they're growing pains, and Harvard is, for what it's worth, the big megaphone, right? They're the E.F. Hutton, everybody listens. And so my goal through them was to be able to get that kind of national visibility for this information. They're not ready. Part of the reason everybody listens is because they're sticks in the mud, right? They're slow to adopt these things. And oftentimes that's a good thing, not so much in this case. So can I talk to your mom's doctors? Maybe. I don't think that talking to them will get them to write the medicine, but what it will do is get them to understand her need and the need for me to be on the team with them. And I think that that would go a long way to making your mom better. And the issues around federal housing are enormous. I have this come up for my patients all the time. There's no good answer there yet. Other questions?
Yeah, Zoom. Just going back to what we were speaking about before. Sorry, Stephanie Sorrell, Master of Science and cannabis patient and cancer patient. Have any of the states or the commissions spoken about, one, recognizing that yes, cannabinoid therapy is a specialization on its own, and creating a standardized, like what you were saying with the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, but creating something where states are subsidizing the required like pharmacist or physician that's at the dispensary. That way that the licensing and all the costs that these dispensaries are essentially putting towards subsidizing a professional that patients can then contact. Has that ever been brought up?
I'd say yes-ish. I know that some states, this year in a couple of our states, we went and tried to do things like lower physician fees, lower card costs, but you've got so many stakeholders there. If you lower physician fees, then you're taking out of the physicians' pockets. And if you lower the card costs, we had an interesting example in Arizona where we wanted to have free cards for veterans and lower the card costs from like $200 to $50. How could we do that? Because revenue from the adult use program went back into the state so that states could subsidize that card cost. So the answer is yes, some states are trying. I can't speak that we've had meaningful, uniform thought, but it's a great thought because folks are also trying to work on that.
That's it. All right. Well, thank you guys.